I still remember the night my 6-year-old daughter looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked if our family had done something wrong. We had just moved into what was supposed to be our dream home, a quiet community with palm trees and a playground where our kids could finally play without freezing cold winters holding them back. For the first 2 weeks, everything felt perfect. Then, one neighbor decided he didn't want us there. It started small. A complaint here, a strange comment there. But it grew into something that made my children afraid to play outside, made my wife afraid to sit on our own balcony, and made me question whether the biggest mistake of my life was signing a 12-month lease we couldn't afford to break. We had nowhere to go and no way out. What happened over the next year tested everything we believed about home, about belonging, and about how far one man would go to make sure we never felt welcome. This is what happened to my family, and I still think about it every single day. The moving truck pulled away, and I stood there in the parking lot of our new apartment, watching it disappear down the street. My hands were still shaking from carrying boxes for 6 hours straight, but it was a different kind of shaking. It was relief. I had spent 11 years shoveling snow off my driveway every winter morning before going to work. 11 years of watching my landscaping business shrink to almost nothing between November and March, while my bank account did the same thing. 11 years of telling my wife, Kavya, that things would get better, that we just needed one more season, one more year, and now, finally, we were here. Florida, warm air, green grass in December, a place where I could work 12 months a year instead of 7. I should have known that peace doesn't come that easy. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that I was 41 years old, standing in a parking lot with my wife and 2 kids, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Kavya came up beside me and put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We had talked about this move for almost 2 years before we finally did it. Every conversation ended the same way, with both of us scared, but both of us agreeing it was time. Our son Ishan was 9. Our daughter Anaya was 6. They ran ahead of us toward the building, laughing about something only kids can find funny after a 10-hour drive. I watched them and felt my chest tighten in a good way, the way it does when you see your children happy and you know, for once, that happiness wasn't an accident. It was something you worked for. The apartment complex was called Palm Hollow. It had a small playground near the pool, a clubhouse with a gym nobody seemed to use, and rows of 2-story buildings painted a soft yellow color. There were palm trees lining the walkway, the kind I had only seen in postcards growing up in Chennai. I remember thinking, this looks like a place where a family could be happy. We signed a 12-month lease. That part is important, because it's the reason we couldn't just walk away later, when things became what they became. 12 months. Almost every dollar we had saved went into the security deposit, the first and last month's rent, and the moving costs. There was no extra cushion, no backup plan, just us, our 2 kids, and a contract that tied us to that building for a full year. The first 2 weeks were, honestly, the best 2 weeks our family had experienced in years. Ishan made a friend on the second day, a boy from the building next to ours. They rode bikes around the parking lot until the streetlights came on. Anaya discovered the playground and decided it was the greatest place on earth. She would come home with sand in her shoes and a kind of joy on her face that I hadn't seen since before the cold months back home used to keep her inside for weeks at a time. Kavya started talking about painting again. She used to paint before the kids were born. Small canvases of flowers and old temples she remembered from her childhood. She hadn't touched a brush in almost 5 years. One evening I found her sitting on our small balcony with a sketchbook, just looking at the sunset, and something in her face had softened. I didn't say anything. I just sat next to her and watched the sky turn orange and pink over the rooftops. For the first time in a long time, I believed we had made the right decision. I started working almost immediately. Word travels fast in these communities, and within the first 10 days, I had picked up 2 lawn care contracts and a small landscaping job for a house 2 streets over. The owner of that house, an older man named Robert, told me he'd recommend me to his neighbors if I did good work. I worked harder on that lawn than I think I've worked on anything in my life. By the end of the month, I had 5 regular clients. It felt like the universe was finally giving us a break. That's when I first noticed him. His name was Nikhil Arora. He lived in the unit directly across from ours, separated only by a narrow strip of grass and a sidewalk. I remember the first time I saw him clearly, standing on his small patio with his arms crossed, watching my kids play near the mailbox area. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched. I thought maybe he was having a bad day. Everyone has those. A few days later, I was taking out the trash when I passed him in the parking lot. I nodded and said good morning, the way I do with everyone. He looked at me for a second longer than felt normal, then walked past without a word. Kavya noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it at first. She mentioned that when she took Anaya to the playground, he would sometimes come outside and stand on his balcony, not doing anything, just watching them play. She said it made her uncomfortable, but she also told herself she was probably overthinking it. New place, new people, maybe he was just quiet. I wanted to believe that too. About 3 weeks after we moved in, the first complaint came. It was a Saturday afternoon. Ishan and his new friend were playing basketball near the side of our building, the same spot where half the kids in the complex played every single day. I was inside, cleaning my landscaping tools after a long week of work, when I heard a knock at the door. It was the property manager, a woman named Diane. She was polite, almost apologetic, as she explained that someone had filed a noise complaint about the basketball. "Which unit?" I asked, mostly out of curiosity. She hesitated, then told me it didn't matter, that the rules applied to everyone, and that the basketball hoop area had specific hours posted on a sign I hadn't even noticed before. I apologized, told her it wouldn't happen again, and went to find Ishan to explain that he needed to play earlier in the day. I didn't think much of it. Rules are rules. I respected that. But 2 days later, there was another complaint. This time it was about our car being parked in a guest spot for too long, even though we had 2 assigned spots and Kavya's sister had been visiting for the weekend. Then there was a complaint about Anaya's chalk drawings on the sidewalk outside our building, even though I had seen at least 4 other children doing the exact same thing without any issue. Each time Diane would come by, always polite, always slightly uncomfortable, explaining the same thing. Someone had complained. She never told us who, not directly. But by the 3rd complaint, I didn't need her to say the name. I had started noticing a pattern. Every time something happened near our apartment, Nikhil's car was the one parked closest. Every time I saw him on his patio, his eyes were on us, not on anything else. One evening, I was watering the small flower bed Kavya had planted near our front step. Something simple, just a few marigolds she'd brought from the nursery to make the place feel like home. Nikhil walked by with his trash bag, and for the first time, he actually spoke to me. "You know there's a rule about personal gardens outside your unit," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't friendly either. It was flat, careful, like he had rehearsed it. "I didn't know that," I said honestly. "I'll check with the office." He looked at the flowers for a moment, then at me, and said something I will never forget. "Some people just don't understand how things work here." He walked away before I could respond, and I stood there holding the watering can, feeling something settle in my stomach that I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something quieter, something that felt a lot like the cold I thought I had left behind in the north. That night, after the kids were asleep, I told Kavya what he said. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small marigolds through our window, lit faintly by the porch light. "Maybe it's nothing," she said, but her voice didn't sound like she believed it. I didn't believe it either. Something had shifted, and I had no idea yet how far it would go, or how much it would cost us to find out. The complaints didn't stop after that night. If anything, they got worse, and they got faster. Like once Nikhil realized we weren't going to fight back loudly, he felt free to push a little further each time. The following week, Diane knocked on our door again. This time, it was about noise after 9 p.m. I remember standing there confused, because the only thing happening that night was Anaya's small cough, the kind every child gets, and the television playing quietly in the living room. I asked Diane, as gently as I could, what exactly the noise was. She looked down at her clipboard and said, "Voices, talking loudly." I wanted to laugh, but nothing about it felt funny anymore. We hadn't raised our voices once that evening. I told her that, and she nodded, like she already knew it probably wasn't true. But her job wasn't to investigate. Her job was to pass along complaints and make sure residents followed the rules. I understood that. I didn't blame her. I blamed the silence that came right after she left, when Kavya looked at me from the kitchen, her hands still wet from washing dishes, and asked quietly, "How long is this going to keep happening?" I didn't have an answer for her. A few days later, something happened that made the whole situation impossible to ignore. Ishan had come home from school upset, the kind of upset where a 9-year-old doesn't want to talk, but you can see it sitting right behind his eyes. It took almost 20 minutes of sitting with him on the couch before he told me what happened. He had been riding his bike near the mailbox area, the same spot kids had been riding bikes since the day we moved in. Nikhil had come out of his apartment and told him, in front of 2 other kids, that he needed to go play somewhere else because he was messing up the grass. Ishan said the other kids had laughed, not because they thought it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. My son looked at me and asked the question that broke something quiet inside me. Dad, did we do something wrong? I told him no. I told him some people are just having a hard time and it has nothing to do with him. But that night, lying in bed, I kept hearing his voice. Did we do something wrong? 9 years old, and he was already trying to figure out if his family had somehow earned this kind of treatment. I want to be clear about something. Nikhil never used a slur. He never said anything that could be written down and shown to someone as obvious proof of what was happening. He was careful. Every complaint had a technical reason behind it. Every comment had just enough room for someone to say, well, maybe he just cares about the rules. But Kavya and I both knew what we were feeling. We had felt versions of it before, in smaller ways, throughout our lives in this country. The slightly too long stare in a grocery store. The customer who explained something to me slowly, like I might not understand English, even though I had a master's degree from a university in this very state. We had learned over the years how to recognize that particular kind of discomfort other people had around us, even when they dressed it up in something that sounded reasonable. This felt like that, except sharper, except closer, except aimed directly at our children. I decided to go talk to him myself. It was a Sunday morning, and I saw him outside, washing his car in the small parking area. I walked over, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to remember that I wasn't just representing myself in that moment, but my whole family, and how this conversation went could shape the rest of our year, living 20 feet from this man. Nikhil, I said, can we talk for a minute? He turned off the hose and looked at me, his expression unreadable. I wanted to ask, I continued, if there's something specific going on. My son came home upset after what happened with his bike. I just want to understand what's bothering you, so we can find a way to get along. He was quiet for a moment, and for one brief second, I thought maybe we were about to have an honest conversation. Maybe he would tell me something real, something we could actually work through. Instead, he said, I just think this community used to be quieter before certain people moved in. I felt my jaw tighten. Certain people. He shrugged, like the words cost him nothing. You know what I mean. I didn't trust myself to respond right away. I stood there for a few seconds, breathing, thinking about Ishan's face the night before, thinking about Kavya's quiet question, thinking about every dollar of our savings sitting inside the walls of this complex we couldn't leave for another 10 months. We pay rent here just like you, I finally said. Our kids have the same right to play outside as anyone else's kids. He didn't argue. He just turned the hose back on and went back to washing his car, like the conversation had never happened. I walked back to our apartment feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not since my early days in this country, working long hours for a landscaping company that wasn't mine, listening to a manager joke about my accent in front of other employees and laughing along because I needed the job too much to say anything. That feeling of being small, of being tolerated, but not wanted. I didn't tell Kavya everything he said. I told her enough, that the conversation hadn't gone well, that he seemed to have some kind of issue with us specifically. She didn't push for more details. I think she already understood, the same way I did, what kind of issue that probably was. Over the next 2 weeks, the complaints became almost constant. Our mail was supposedly being delivered to the wrong box, though nothing else in the complex seemed to have this exact problem. Someone reported that our car alarm had gone off in the middle of the night. Even though neither of our cars has an alarm system, Diane started looking tired every time she came to our door. Like she also knew something didn't add up, but had no way to prove it. We started keeping a small notebook, writing down every complaint, every date, every interaction. Kavya's idea. She said if this ever became something bigger, something legal, we needed proof that this was a pattern, not a coincidence. I remember the night she started that notebook. She sat at our kitchen table, the kids already asleep, writing everything down in her careful handwriting, and I watched her and felt something heavy settle over both of us. We had moved here to escape hard winters and disappearing income. We hadn't expected to need a notebook documenting harassment from a neighbor before our first season in Florida had even ended. We can't keep living like this, she said quietly, not looking up from the page. I know, I said, but we can't leave either. I know that too. We sat there in silence for a long time after that, both of us staring at a notebook that represented something neither of us wanted to admit out loud. That the dream we had worked so hard for had a shadow attached to it we hadn't seen coming, and we had no idea yet how dark that shadow was about to get. The notebook filled up faster than either of us expected. By the start of our second month at Palm Hollow, we had documented 11 separate incidents. 11 complaints, warnings, or strange occurrences, all connected somehow to the apartment directly across from ours. 11 entries in Kavya's careful handwriting, each one small enough on its own to seem like nothing, but together forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. What I didn't write down, because there's no place for it in a notebook of dates and complaints, was how it felt to live like that. How it felt to walk outside my own front door and immediately scan the area to see if he was watching. How it felt to tell Ishan to keep his voice down, not because we were doing anything wrong, but because I didn't want to give anyone a reason to call the office again. How it felt to watch Kavya stop sitting on the balcony with her sketchbook because she said she could feel eyes on her from across the walkway, even when nobody was actually there. We had moved to Florida for warmth, and somehow we were living colder than we ever had up north. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in our second month. I had just gotten home from a long day of work, my back aching from installing a stone walkway for a client 3 towns over. Kavya met me at the door, and I could tell immediately from her face that something had happened. Anaya was at the playground, she said, with 2 other kids from the building. Nikhil came over and told them they couldn't play on the slide because, and these are his words, it's reserved for residents who've been here longer. I felt something cold move through my chest. That's not a real rule. There's no seniority system for a playground. I know that, Kavya said. Anaya didn't. She came home crying, asking me if we did something wrong to make him angry. There it was again. The same question Ishan had asked weeks earlier, now coming from our 6-year-old daughter too. Did we do something wrong? 2 children, both starting to internalize the idea that maybe their family was the problem, when all we had ever done was move into an apartment and try to build a life. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every option we had. We couldn't break the lease without paying a penalty that would have wiped out almost everything we had left. We couldn't sue over something that, on paper, looked like a series of small, separate, technically defensible incidents. We couldn't even prove that Nikhil was the one filing every complaint, even though we both knew it in our bones. What we could do, I decided, was stop being invisible about it. The next morning, I called Diane and asked for an official meeting, not a hallway conversation, but a real sit-down meeting with the property management. I told her I wanted to bring our documentation. She sounded surprised, then said she would set something up for the following week. In the meantime, I did something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I started talking to other neighbors. Not in an aggressive way, just simple conversations. A nod that turned into small talk that turned into actual connection. I learned that the family 2 doors down, the Garcias, had also received a noise complaint around the same time as one of ours, on a night they swore they hadn't even been home. I learned that an older couple near the clubhouse had once had a disagreement with Nikhil over parking, years before we ever moved in, and that he had reported their visiting grandchildren for loitering near the pool. It turned out we weren't his first target. We were just his current one. This part is important, because it changed something in how I saw the whole situation. For weeks I had been carrying this quiet, heavy feeling that maybe there was something specifically wrong with us. Something about being the new Indian family in the building that had made us a target in a way nobody else had been. And while I still believed, and still believe, that part of what was happening was rooted in something uglier than simple pickiness about rules, learning about the Garcias and the older couple reminded me that this man had a pattern that went beyond just us. We were not the only ones who had felt small under his watch. We were simply the latest. That realization didn't fix anything, but it gave me something I had been missing. It gave me allies. Mrs. Garcia, in particular, became someone Kavya started talking to almost every day. She had lived in the complex for 6 years and knew the property management company well. She told Kavya something that changed everything. They've had complaints about him before, she said. Multiple residents over the years. But unless people come forward together, with actual records, the office tends to treat each complaint like it's isolated. They don't connect the dots unless someone forces them to. That was exactly what we needed to hear. I spent the next 4 days after work, instead of resting, organizing our notebook into something more formal. I typed up every entry with dates, times, and descriptions. Kavya reached out to Mrs. Garcia and the older couple, whose names were Frank and Patricia, and asked if they would be willing to share their experiences too. Both agreed, almost immediately, like they had been waiting years for someone to finally ask. The night before our meeting with property management, I sat at the kitchen table with 4 printed pages and felt something I hadn't felt in 2 months. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Something like the feeling of standing at the edge of a fight you didn't choose, but had finally decided you were ready for. Kavya sat across from me, reading through everything one more time. "Do you think this will actually change anything?" she asked. I thought about Ishan's question. Did we do something wrong? I thought about Anaya crying at the playground. I thought about every dollar we had put into this new life. Every hope we'd carried with us on that 10-hour drive from the cold north to what we believed would be warmth, in every sense of the word. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know what happens if we stay quiet. Nothing changes. At least this way we tried." She nodded and reached across the table to hold my hand, the way she used to when we were younger, back when every hard decision in our life still felt like something we were facing together for the very first time. We had no idea, sitting there that night, just how much that meeting the next day would change everything that came after. We only knew that for the first time since this whole thing started, we weren't facing it alone anymore. The meeting was set for 6 o'clock in the evening, after most people finished work. I remember walking into the small office in the clubhouse, holding the folder with our documentation, my hands sweating despite the air conditioning. Kavya walked beside me, and right behind us were Frank and Patricia, and a few minutes later, Mrs. Garcia and her husband arrived too. I think that's the moment Diane realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation about one family's complaints. This was 5 households walking in together. We sat around a long table, and I laid out everything we had. Every date, every incident, every small detail that alone meant almost nothing, but together painted a picture nobody in that room could pretend not to see. Mrs. Garcia spoke about her own experience from years earlier. Frank and Patricia talked about what had happened with their grandchildren at the pool. I talked about Ishan's bike, about Anaya at the playground, about the marigolds Kavya had planted that apparently violated some rule nobody else seemed to know existed. Diane was quiet for most of it, taking notes, her face shifting somewhere between discomfort and something that looked a lot like recognition. I think she had suspected something like this for a long time, but had never had enough in front of her to act on it. At the end, she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "I'm sorry this happened to your families. This should have been addressed a long time ago." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no raised voices, no big confrontation, no movie-style ending where Nikhil showed up and apologized with tears in his eyes. Real life rarely works that way. What happened instead was quieter, and somehow more meaningful. The property management company opened a formal investigation. They pulled records of every complaint filed over the past several years and cross-referenced the names. They interviewed residents privately, away from any pressure. 3 weeks later, we received a letter explaining that Nikhil's lease, which happened to be ending soon anyway, would not be renewed. I won't pretend that letter erased everything that had happened. It didn't erase the night Ishan came home upset about the bike. It didn't erase Anaya's tears at the playground, or the months Kavya stopped sitting on the balcony with her sketchbook because she felt watched. It didn't erase the quiet fear I had carried every single day, wondering what new complaint might show up next, wondering if our family would always feel like outsiders in a place we had worked so hard to call home. But it did something else. It gave us back something we had lost without even realizing it. It gave us back the feeling of safety in our own home. The week after Nikhil moved out, something shifted in the whole building. I don't think it was just because he was gone. I think it was because, for the first time, our neighbors had seen us not as the new family who might cause problems, but as people who had stood up calmly and honestly for something fair. Mrs. Garcia started inviting Kavya over for coffee. Frank began stopping by some evenings just to talk about gardening, since he had noticed how much care I put into the small flower bed that had once gotten me in so much trouble. Patricia started bringing Anaya little treats whenever she saw her at the pool. Slowly, the community we had imagined on our very first day at Palm Hollow, the one with green grass and friendly faces and children laughing at the playground, became real. Not because everything had been perfect from the start, but because we had fought, quietly and persistently, to make it real. Ishan stopped asking if we had done something wrong. One evening, months later, I overheard him telling his friend a story about the man who used to live across from us, and the way he told it, almost like an old memory instead of an open wound, told me that something in him had healed, even if it had taken time. Anaya went back to spending hours at the playground every single afternoon, completely unaware now of any of the tension that had once hung over that small patch of grass and plastic slides. Watching her laugh out there, without fear, without hesitation, was worth more to me than any apology Nikhil never gave us. Kavya started painting again, too. Not just small pieces here and there, but real paintings, the kind she used to do before life got too busy and too hard to leave room for it. One evening, almost a year after we first moved in, I found her on the balcony again, sketchbook open, the sunset painting the sky in soft orange and pink, the same way it had on one of our very first nights there. She looked up at me and smiled, and for a moment, it felt like we had finally arrived at the place we had been trying to reach the entire time. We ended up staying at Palm Hollow for almost 3 years after that. My landscaping business grew steadily, season after season, no longer interrupted by brutal winters or disappearing income. Eventually, we saved enough to buy a small house not far from there, with a real yard where the kids could play without anyone watching from a window, without anyone deciding which rules applied to which families. Looking back now, I think about that first day in the parking lot, watching the moving truck disappear, feeling that fragile, hopeful relief. I had no idea what was waiting for us. I had no idea how close we would come to feeling like strangers in a place we had worked so hard to belong to, but I also didn't know how strong we would become because of it. I didn't know that the hardest months of our new life would also teach us the most about who our real neighbors were, about who would stand beside us when it mattered, and about how much strength two ordinary people could find when they refused to stay silent. Some nights, even now, in our new house with the real yard and the quiet street, I think about Nikhil. I don't feel anger anymore. Not really. Mostly I feel something closer to sadness. For whatever made a person spend so much energy trying to push a family out of a place they had every right to be. But mostly, when I think back on that year, I don't think about him at all. I think about Ishan's bike, finally moving freely across the grass without anyone telling him to stop. I think about Anaya's laughter at the playground, loud and unafraid. I think about Kavya's paintings, filling our new walls with color. And I think about the quiet, steady proof that no matter how hard someone tries to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere, you have every right to stay, to fight, and to build the life you came there to build. We came to Florida looking for warmth after years of cold winters. What we found, eventually after everything, was something even better than warm weather. We found home.